In this video, we're looking at the 12 major beginner photography mistakes that you need to stop right now. Mistake number one is only photographing at f8 as your aperture. While I understand that f8 is the cleanest part of your lens and the aperture that gives you the least amount of diffraction on the edges of your lens, however, the majority of my photos are actually taken at f14, f16, and I've blown these prints up into massive prints. Using a smaller aperture like this allows you to get the most amount of focus throughout the entire scene of your photo, and a lot of pro photographers actually use this too. Now you can still use f8 and focus stack your photos, but simplicity for me is much more fun in photography because you're not worried about getting something wrong. Just getting it all in one shot is the way to go for me and so many other photographers that I've come across. Mistake number two is only photographing at ISO 100. Now, why is this a big deal? Obviously, the lower ISO you have, the less image noise is coming into the photo. But camera technology continues to improve and the sensor continues to improve here. I have a full video on why you shouldn't shoot at ISO 100. You can click or tap this card showing up on your screen right here to watch that entire video on why you should stop doing this. The next mistake is having no foreground in your photography at all. While you can have no foreground for telephoto photography or abstract photography, including a foreground into your photos actually gives your images depth. This is especially important when you're photographing with something like a wide angle lens, because having the wide angle lens on your camera is actually going to allow you to introduce the most amount of foreground into your images with that composition. Here's a quick hack for using a wide angle lens. When you're photographing, shoot vertically and actually tilt your camera forward just slightly, and that introduces more foreground opportunities and objects for you, plus leading lines into your foreground to allow you to point to your subject. Now that brings us to the next mistake that so many photography beginners make, and you might be making too, and that's having a good foreground but not having any subject for it to point to. Foregrounds are there for depth and for leading lines for you to point to exactly where your subject is. But so many times people overemphasize the foreground and they have no clear subject in their images to pair that with. A photo is truly great when you have a foreground, midground, and background and a clear subject of what you're actually trying to photograph, and that's how composition works best. Now, speaking of composition and the subject, you want to have a clear background. An obvious subject in your photo is the best way for people to see it. Having intersecting lines with your subject or having a cluttered background behind your subject is the #1 way to distract people from what the photograph is actually taken of and why you took the photograph to begin with. You really have to work the scene to get negative space behind your subject or have a lot of clutter removed from that object. Here's a tip for how to do that. Find the subject of your photograph and amplify anything that's pointing to your subject and remove anything that is distracting you from your subject. Doing that over and over again is going to simplify your photo, but also declutter your background and help your photo get better. Now, maybe you're watching this and these tips are working for you. I have a full landscape photography masterclass that's completely free that you can watch right now. That's linked in the video description and in the pinned comment for you to check out. Let's move over to the exposure side. Clipped highlights is a huge mistake that a lot of people make, or making your photo too dark. Clipped highlights just mean that your highlights are too bright and they're actually touching the side of the histogram, thus not having any data in them for you to edit. While your photo can be bright, too bright means that you can't adjust that and correct it in the computer when you're post-processing your images. This makes for a ruined photo because you don't have any detail in those sections of your photo. Now, speaking of post-processing, the next mistake is actually over-editing your photo. There can be so many edits that you can make, and we have so much power at our fingertips using editing and post-processing software. Over-editing your photos can actually make them unrealistic. Now, what I like to do is actually making them unrealistic with my edits, but then I pull that slider down to bring them back to a realistic level. The second they pass into that realistic realm for me, to my eye, is where I stop the editing process and get them to where I want them to be. This allows you to make the most edits possible, but still make your photo look realistic. Now, a little while ago, we mentioned using a wide-angle lens and how to do that with foregrounds, but one mistake that you can actually make is overusing your wide-angle lens. When you're starting to overuse a wide-angle lens, maybe you're just getting into landscape photography and everybody says you've got to get a good wide-angle lens for landscapes. While it's good to have a good wide-angle lens, it's also good to not use your wide-angle lens and put on a telephoto lens or to create an image with a mid-range lens like a 50mm lens. While wide angles can look great with some scenes, a lot of times they're the wrong lens choice for others. When things are far away and you don't have any foreground to add to your photo, get a different lens out and try to see a landscape in a completely new way. Telephoto lenses allow you to pinpoint the beautiful single parts that make up the whole scene of a wide-angle lens. This allows you to get more photos in each specific location and thus coming out with more beautiful photos everywhere you go. Now let's stick with gear for a second. The next mistake is not using a tripod. Tripods should be used for pretty much any photo that you can use them with. I probably handhold about 5% of all of my photos that I take, just because landscape photography is so dependent on sharp focus that if you're not using a tripod at anything below 1/60th of a second in your shutter speed, you're introducing any option of camera shake to be seen in your photos, especially if you have the goal of selling any prints. So not using a tripod in any long exposure or dark photography is a huge mistake, and you should always have one in your bag. Even if I'm photographing at 1/200th of a second of a landscape, I'm gonna have my camera on a tripod as much as possible. Now, when you have that camera on a tripod, you wanna be sure that your horizon is completely straight across. This is a huge mistake that I see a lot of photographers make when I'm doing critiques with them every single month. What happens with this is you get one tilt of a horizon line up and your whole photo is off. You want to be sure to have that horizon line straight all the way across. One way to help you do this is going to the display options on your camera and using the level to be sure when your camera is completely straight. A crooked horizon line can lead to a bad composition, and that's the next mistake. You want to be sure that your composition is sound. Now, think about composition like this. It's the strategic way that you intentionally point your viewer exactly where you want them to look step by step. So here's a classic way of doing that. You have a foreground with a leading line. That line takes you directly to the midground or the main subject of your photo. And then in the background, you have a nice glowing light or atmospheric condition, maybe some clouds in the background too. This is the classic composition for wide-angle lens landscape photography, but you can have some nice compositions with telephoto lens photography too, secluding out your subject against a decluttered background and having that where you want it. Composition is the #1 way to improve your photo, so you want to get a good composition. I always tell people this: somebody who understands composition but is just using an iPhone will take better photos than somebody who's using the best camera possible but does not understand composition. So you want to be sure that you understand composition above all else. Bad light is the next mistake. Now, so many people, when they're starting out in landscape photography, they go out on blue sky days because that's when the temperature is great. You want to be out with your family having fun, but they may see that blue sky days introduce a lot of harsh highlights and shadows right next to each other, or cluttered forest scenes because there's a lot of different light going on. Bad light can be the #1 culprit to a photo failing. Now, when do you go out and photograph great images? You still can go out in the middle of the day and get great images. It just depends on what the light is doing. If it's a cloudy day, maybe some fog in the area, and it's midday, go out and photograph waterfalls or forest scenes, and that would be the ideal light for those situations. Maybe for overlooks, you want great light in those situations. That's going to be the light closer to sunrise and sunset. So you want to be sure you understand light, what it's doing, and where it's hitting your subject so that you can get the dream photos that you want exactly how you want them. Now, to understand where light's coming from or where it's going to be, I'd highly recommend using the app called PhotoPills. I have a full video detailing how to use PhotoPills on this card showing up on your screen right now. If you want more in-field tips on landscape photography, go ahead and click or tap this playlist showing up on your screen right now.